We start in the United States, where in the past few hours, President Biden has delivered his last State of the Union address before the presidential election in November. In the speech, he warned that the US is facing a greater threat to its freedom and democracy than at any time since the presidency of Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s. He condemned Donald Trump and described his recent remarks about NATO as unacceptable. Mr. Biden said he had inherited an economy on the brink after the turmoil of COVID pandemic, but it was now the envy of the world. He said the American people were writing the greatest comeback story never told. But it was his repeated attacks on Mr. Trump which drew the biggest cheers on Capitol Hill.
Now my predecessor, a former Republican president, tells Putin, quote, "Do whatever the hell you want." That's a quote. A former president actually said that, bowing down to a Russian leader. I think it's outrageous, it's dangerous, and it's unacceptable.
Mr. Biden also talked about abortion, promising to restore it as a federal right.
Many of you in this chamber and my predecessor are promising to pass a national ban on reproductive freedom. My God, what freedom else would you take away? Look, it's a decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. The Supreme Court majority wrote the following, and with all due respect, justices, women are not without electoral power. Electoral or political power. You're about to realize just how much you're right about that. Those bragging about overturning Roe v. Wade have no clue about the power of women. But they found out when reproductive freedom was on the ballot. We won in 2022 and 2020, and we'll win again in 2024.
Mr. Biden also warned that support for Ukraine needs to continue.
Freedom and democracy are under attack both at home and overseas at the very same time. Overseas, Putin of Russia is on the march, invading Ukraine and sowing chaos throughout Europe and beyond. If anybody in this room thinks Putin will stop at Ukraine, I assure you he will not. But Ukraine can stop Putin. Ukraine can stop Putin if we stand with Ukraine and provide the weapons that needs to defend itself. That is all Ukraine is asking. They're not asking for American soldiers. In fact, there are no American soldiers at war in Ukraine, and I'm determined to keep it that way.
Our reporter in Washington, Helena Humphrey, gave us her analysis of how the address has been received.
I think it has changed the mood with regards to the president's mental acuity, his sharpness, questions about his age, which were just looming so large over this address. It was such a high-stakes address. It felt like there was no margin for error here for President Biden. And this speech was blistering. President Biden has his voice raised almost throughout the entirety of this speech. And speaking to Democrats here in reaction, they say that it was a fiery speech. Republicans saying, some of them unhappy with it, saying instead that it was a campaign speech. The truth of it is that it was always going to have to be a campaign speech, particularly when we now know that very likely he will be facing Donald Trump in this election. He took on topics ranging from freedom and democracy. That was the overarching theme, saying it's under attack like never before, saying that Putin will not stop at Ukraine, saying that a national security bill has to be passed in order to get that aid to Ukraine. Also calling on Republicans to pass a bill for the border, knowing that's one of the top of mind issues for voters. And then on the issue of women's rights, reproductive rights, saying he would restore Roe versus Wade. On the economy, acknowledging families have felt pain in the face of stubbornly high inflation, but saying that taxes should be cut, that there should be higher taxes, I should say, for the wealthy and corporations to try and bring some of that economic pain down. He did mention his predecessor 13 times, of course, that being Donald Trump. And I think in doing so, he's very much squarely laid down the gauntlet for a 2020 rerun. I think he did them by taking to the stage very confidently. He spent a lot of time in the room first, talking with lawmakers, senators, doing what Joe Biden does best. He enjoys that kind of politics. And then even in some moments, we saw him go off the cuff in moments. That was the question. Would we see that? Would he respond to hecklers? He did at one moment speak to Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who had asked him to say the name of a young woman who'd been killed by an illegal, undocumented migrant. And he did so. He engaged with her and said, as a father who's also lost children, I know that pain, directly speaking to the family of Laken Riley. Also speaking with some kind of comments about shrinkflation, making off-the-cuff comments about the size of chocolate bars, for example, in this country, and also making a joke about his age as well, saying that he believes that this gives him the experience to run again for another 4 years. So he tackled it, I think, head on, because he knew that so many people would be watching for any kind of slip up, and it was the elephant in the room.
Helena Humphrey there. Now, on foreign affairs, President Biden confirmed that he had ordered the US military to build a temporary pier off the coast of Gaza. He said it would ensure a massive increase in aid for Palestinians. He warned Israel that humanitarian assistance should never be used as a bargaining chip.
Protecting and saving innocent lives has to be a priority. As we look to the future, the only real solution to the situation is a two-state solution over time. And I say this as a lifelong supporter of Israel. My entire career, no one has a stronger record with Israel than I do. I challenge any of you here. I'm the only American president of Israel in wartime. But there is no other path that guarantees Israel's security and democracy. There is no other path that guarantees Palestinians can live in peace with peace and dignity.
We'll have a reaction and analysis on President Biden's comments on Israel and Gaza in just a few minutes with our correspondent in Jerusalem.